Cold gel spread across her belly, and for one fragile moment, the only sound in the world was her daughter's heartbeat racing through the small speaker of the ultrasound machine. Margot Kessler, 27 years old, with dark brown hair in a tangled mess and gray-blue eyes swollen from too many sleepless nights, lay on the examination table in a quiet room of a Boston hospital, and for the first time in months, she felt as though she could breathe. Week 28. A baby girl. After one miscarriage that had nearly broken her, this child was finally going to stay. She tightened her hand around the ultrasound photo, the ink not yet dry, and smiled at the tiny shape on the screen. While the television mounted in the corner of the waiting room played the morning news, she hadn't bothered to notice, until the anchor's voice cut through everything like a blade. Breaking news this morning: Barrett Langford, Chief Executive Officer of Langford Capital, has just announced his upcoming wedding to his longtime girlfriend, Genevieve Ashworth, at the Ashworth family estate on Martha's Vineyard next month. Margot stopped breathing. On the screen, her husband, her Barrett, the man who had stood before the altar 3 years prior and promised her forever, was standing on a red carpet in a gray suit, his arm wrapped around the waist of a blonde woman in a white dress, the diamond ring on her hand catching the flash of cameras, and he was smiling at her in a way he had stopped smiling at Margot a very long time ago. Her daughter's heartbeat was still pounding through the speaker. The ultrasound gel was still wet and cold on her belly, and a mother sitting beside her began to turn and look at her, then whisper to the person next to her, and then the whole waiting room turned to stare at her. The woman who was 7 months pregnant, whose husband had just announced on national television that he was marrying someone else. Margot didn't cry. She didn't scream. She stood up, slipped out of the hospital room in silence, still gripping the ultrasound photo in her hand, and sat down on the freezing stone bench in front of the lobby, alone, while her world had just collapsed, and no one in it had bothered to tell her first. But she didn't know that this very moment, that very cold stone bench, was where her real life would begin, and the man who would change everything wasn't anyone she could have imagined. If this story touches you, please hit like so more people can hear it. Share it with someone who needs to believe that life can still begin again. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because the next part won't let you walk away. Dr. Elaine Marsh found her on that stone bench 15 minutes after a nurse called the name Margot Kessler over the loudspeaker for the 3rd time, and no one answered. She stepped out through the hospital lobby doors, looked left, then right, and saw her sitting there alone, her back rigidly straight, both hands resting on her 7-month pregnant belly, the ultrasound photo still caught between fingers gone white from gripping it too tightly. She was 52 years old, with salt and pepper hair cut just to her shoulders, round silver-framed glasses, and she had been an obstetrician long enough to know there were moments that didn't need words. She sat down beside Margot on the freezing stone bench, didn't ask, didn't comfort, just sat there. 2 women silent between the sound of traffic and the streetlights beginning to glow in the September dusk. 1 minute passed, 2 minutes. Then Margot said, her voice hoarse and thick, as though someone had closed a hand around her throat, "Dr. Marsh, my husband is about to marry someone else. I just saw it on television." Dr. Marsh didn't look surprised. She only nodded very slowly, as if Margot had just said it was going to rain, and then she spoke in the warm, low voice Margot had heard for the past 2 years, ever since that first miscarriage. "Margot, I need to tell you something else first. Your blood pressure reading is unusually high. It isn't immediately dangerous yet, but it needs to be watched closely over the next few weeks. We'll talk about that later." She stopped, placing her hand over Margot's. "But right now I'm asking you this. Do you have anyone to call? Parents, friends, anyone at all?" Margot thought about the people in her life, and the list was painfully short. Her mother had died of cancer when she was 12. Her friends from high school had slowly fallen away after she married Barrett and moved to Boston. Only 2 people remained, her father and Phoebe. She pulled out her phone with a trembling hand, called her father, and when Walter Kessler answered on the 2nd ring, she only managed to say, "Dad," before her voice broke completely. Walter Kessler, 58 years old, a carpenter in the town of Camden, Maine, the quietest man Margot had ever known, didn't ask what had happened. He didn't ask whether she was all right. He only said, in a voice as steady as the oak tables he built every day, "You tell me where you are. I'm coming right now." Then he hung up, and Margot knew that in a seaside town 4 hours from Boston, her father was leaving everything unfinished, putting on his old flannel shirt again, locking the door of his woodworking shop and getting into the pickup truck he had driven for 15 years. Dr. Marsh didn't let Margot sit outside on the stone bench and wait. She brought her back into the clinic, made her a cup of hot tea in a paper hospital cup, and sat beside her for the next 4 hours. She didn't ask about Barrett. She didn't turn on the television. She told Margot about the cat she had just adopted from the rescue shelter, a 12-year-old cat no one had wanted, and she had named it Tuesday because she adopted it on a Tuesday. She talked about her niece, who had just started first grade and had already announced to the entire family that when she grew up, she was going to be an astronaut who sold ice cream on Mars. Margot didn't laugh, but she listened, and hearing someone's voice talk about ordinary, tiny things that had nothing to do with the diamond ring on that blonde woman's hand was the only thing keeping her from sinking. Near midnight, the clinic door opened. Walter Kessler stood there in his worn old moss-green flannel shirt, smelling of pine wood and machine oil, his warm brown eyes so much like Margot's but rimmed red from driving 4 hours through the night. He said nothing. He stepped inside, bent down, and pulled his daughter into his arms, careful not to press against her pregnant belly, and Margot buried her face in her father's shoulder, breathing in the smell of wood, the smell of the workshop, the smell of home, and for the first time since hearing the news anchor's voice on television, she felt someone holding her back, keeping her from falling. Dr. Marsh stood in the corner of the room, quietly folding the thin blanket on the examination bed, pretending to be busy so father and daughter could have their own space. Then she walked over, shook Walter's hand, and said gently, "Mr. Kessler, your daughter is healthy, the baby is healthy, but her blood pressure needs close monitoring. I'll send the records to any doctor near wherever she'll be staying. Take care of her." Walter nodded only once, solidly, the way he drove the final nail into a board. Then he placed his own coat around Margot's shoulders, picked up her bag, and led her out to the truck. Margot sat in the passenger seat of her father's old pickup, her hand resting on her belly, the ultrasound photo now crumpled because she had held it so tightly for so long, but she still wouldn't let it go. Phoebe would pick up her car from the hospital later. Walter had called her on the way there. As the truck pulled out of the hospital parking lot and joined the nighttime road heading north, Margot watched the lights of Boston grow smaller in the rearview mirror, and she thought she was leaving everything behind. But in truth, she was carrying with her the only thing that mattered. For the first 3 days in Camden, Margot didn't leave her room. She lay on the single bed from her girlhood, curled beneath the old blanket her mother had sewn from scraps of fabric before she died, and she didn't cry anymore because she had no tears left. She only lay there, staring at the white wall yellowed with age, listening to the sea wind blow through the wooden window frame. Her father had never been willing to replace because he said old wood lasted longer than new wood. Every morning, Walter placed a tray outside her bedroom door. On it was a bowl of hot porridge, a slice of toast, and a glass of milk. He didn't knock. He didn't call through the door and tell her she had to eat. He simply set the tray down, stood silently outside for a few seconds, long enough for Margot to hear her father's steady breathing, then walked away, his shoes heavy against the hallway's wooden floor, followed by the sound of the woodworking shop door opening at the back of the house. Then the sound of the wood plane beginning, steady, patient, like a heartbeat. Margot finished every meal, not because she was hungry, but because she knew her father would come back for the tray, and if the food was untouched, his eyes would hurt in a way he would never put into words. Her phone was still turned off, lying in the drawer of the nightstand. She didn't want to know what the outside world was saying about her. She didn't want to know whether Barrett had called, though deep down she already knew the answer, because if he had meant to call, he would have called 3 months ago, 6 months ago, on the day he stopped coming home for dinner and started sleeping at the office and looking at her as though he were looking through a pane of glass. On the 4th day, close to noon, Margot heard an unfamiliar car stop on the gravel road in front of the house. Then the car door slammed shut, then quick, decisive footsteps on the porch steps, then a knock at her bedroom door. Not Walter's gentle knock, but a constant, angry knock that refused to stop. Phoebe Whitmore, 28 years old, the owner of a small flower shop in Portland, Margot's best friend since 7th grade, the girl with curly reddish-brown hair that always had a flower petal stuck somewhere on her, and wide green eyes that cried as easily as April rain, stood outside Margot's bedroom door and knocked for 10 straight minutes without stopping. She hadn't called ahead. She hadn't asked whether she could come. She had driven 2 hours from Portland down to Camden because Walter had called her the night before and said only one sentence, "Phoebe, I need you to come down and help." And Phoebe had closed her flower shop the next morning without needing to hear another word. When Margot finally opened the door, eyes swollen, hair tangled, wearing the same old pajamas from 3 days ago, Phoebe looked her up and down and said, not with pity, not with tears, but in the voice of a friend who had pulled her through enough terrible things since high school, "Get up, take a shower. I'm taking you out to eat." Margot was about to say she didn't want to eat. She didn't want to go outside. She didn't want to look at anyone. But Phoebe had already walked straight into the bathroom, turned on the hot water, came back out and tossed Margot a clean towel, then said, "I'll be in the kitchen. You've got 15 minutes. She didn't hug Margot. She didn't cry. She didn't sit down beside the bed, hold her friend's hand, and say everything was going to be all right. Phoebe understood that Margot had heard enough empty comfort. She didn't need one more person telling her she deserved better. She needed someone to make her stand up, step out of that dark room, get into a car, eat a bowl of hot pho at the little restaurant in town, and remember that the world outside was still turning, that basil still smelled sweet, that the September sun in Maine still slanted through a car window and warmed her hand. And that was exactly what Phoebe did. She drove Margot out to eat, didn't ask about Barrett, didn't mention the news, only told her about a strange customer at the flower shop the week before, an old man who ordered 12 bouquets of red roses every week to send to his wife, even though they lived in the same house, because he said, "I want her to remember every Monday that I choose her." Margot didn't laugh, but she finished the whole bowl of pho, and that was enough. That was all Phoebe needed to see today. That night, after Phoebe fell asleep in the living room on the old sofa, Margot lay in her childhood bed and stared up at the ceiling. There was a small crack running across it right above her headboard, a crack she had imagined as a constellation when she was little, and named the Margot constellation, and her mother had laughed when she heard the name and said it was the most beautiful constellation in the sky. The crack was still there, 15 years later, on the ceiling her father never repainted, because he kept everything exactly as it had been since his wife died. Margot placed her hand on her belly and felt her daughter kick softly. One kick, and then two, as if the baby were telling her, "I'm still here, Mommy. I'm not going anywhere." And Margot whispered into the darkness, her voice so small that only she and the baby inside her could hear it. "I'm sorry, baby. I'm sorry I chose the wrong man, but I promise, I'll be okay. I'll be okay because of you." The call came on the 7th day, while Margot was sitting at the kitchen table watching Phoebe arrange a bundle of wildflowers she had picked from the garden into the chipped vase on the windowsill. Margot's phone had been turned back on the day before because Phoebe said she needed to stay in contact with Dr. Marsh, and when the screen lit up with the name Barrett Langford, the whole kitchen seemed to freeze. Phoebe looked at the screen, looked at Margot, then stepped out of the kitchen without a word, because she understood there were some calls a person had to take alone. Margot answered. Barrett's voice came through from the other end of the line, and what hurt her more than anything wasn't anger, wasn't coldness, but calm. His voice was calm, as if he were calling his secretary to confirm an afternoon meeting. "My lawyer will send the papers to your father's address in the next few days. Sign them. I've transferred $75,000 into your old account. That's enough. Don't talk to the press. Not one word asking how she was. Not one question about the 7-month pregnant belly he had last seen 3 months ago, when he walked out of the penthouse at midnight and said he had to fly to London for an urgent meeting." Margot sat still, listening to Barrett's even breathing through the phone, the breathing of a man waiting for her to say yes and hang up so he could return to his clean, orderly new life without her in it. And she asked only one question, in a voice that didn't tremble, didn't cry, only stayed flat and hollow. "Do you know the baby is a girl?" Silence. For the first time during the call, Barrett was silent, and that silence lasted 3 seconds, 4 seconds, 5 seconds. Long enough for Margot to understand that either he knew or he didn't know, and both were equally terrible. Then his voice returned, still calm, still smooth and flat as a frozen lake. "Sign the papers, Margot." He hung up. Margot set the phone down on the kitchen table very gently, carefully, as if setting it down any harder would break something inside her that she wouldn't be able to put back together. She didn't know the speakerphone was still on, and that her father was standing in the hallway, his back against the wall, his eyes closed, both hands clenched into fists at his sides. Walter said nothing. He opened his eyes, looked at his daughter sitting motionless at the kitchen table, then turned and went out the back door, Margot heard her father's footsteps on the gravel path, then the woodworking shop door opening, then the sound of the wood plane beginning, not the gentle, careful planing of every other day. This was long, strong, decisive, non-stop, and Margot understood that this was how her father was angry. This was how a man who had lost his wife, and was now watching his daughter be abandoned, handled the rage he had no right to pour onto anyone, because the person who deserved it wasn't worthy of him even walking close. 30 minutes passed. The sound of the plane stopped. Walter came back into the kitchen, washed his hands at the sink, dried them on the towel hanging from the cabinet handle, then sat down beside Margot. The smell of fresh pine followed him in, and Margot knew he had been working on the cradle again. The white oak cradle he had started building when he learned she was pregnant. The cradle he shaped a little each day, patiently, slowly, as if as long as he kept building, his granddaughter would have a safe place to lie when she came into the world. He didn't look at Margot. He looked down at his calloused hands, then said in a very gentle voice, "The year your mother was so sick, when the doctor said she needed one more round of treatment and insurance wouldn't cover it, someone I knew offered to help with the hospital bills. Your mother wanted to refuse. You know your mother. Her pride was higher than a mountain. But that night, she lay beside me, held my hand, and said, 'Walter, pride doesn't keep your daughter warm. Take it, then repay it by living well.'" He paused, swallowed, then continued, "I took it, and I repaid it by raising you. Now you listen to me. Don't let pride burn through $75,000 when you're about to raise a baby. That money belongs to your daughter, not to him." Margot looked at her father. His eyes were wet, but his voice was steady, and she saw in him the shadow of her mother, the woman who had taught him that accepting help wasn't weakness, but courage. She didn't sign the NDA, but she didn't tear it up either. She placed it on the kitchen table, picked up the phone, called Barrett's number back, and when the call went to voicemail, she said in a calm, clear voice, "Barrett, I won't sign, but I won't talk to the press either. Not because you asked me to, but because my daughter doesn't need her mother's face in the papers. Don't call me again." She hung up. Walter looked at his daughter, and for the first time in 7 days, he almost smiled. The next morning, he asked his cousin Randall, a family lawyer in Portland, to send Barrett's lawyer a photograph. In the photograph was the unfinished white oak cradle in the woodworking shop, morning sunlight falling through the shop window and brightening the wood grain Walter had smoothed by hand. On the back of the photograph, he wrote in carpenter's pencil, the letters large, straight, and steady, "The baby has a grandfather." 2 weeks after Barrett's call, Dr. Marsh called Margot in a voice that was gentle but firm. The remote blood pressure readings didn't look good. The numbers were still shifting within a range that required caution, and she said Margot needed to be examined every week from now until the birth, that she could refer Margot to a specialist colleague in Boston if necessary, but the most important thing was that Margot had to be near a major hospital, not in a small town 4 hours from the city where the nearest clinic was only open 3 days a week. Margot sat at her father's kitchen table, listening to Dr. Marsh speak, and looked out the window at Walter standing outside the woodworking shop, wiping his hands on an old towel, and she understood that she couldn't stay in Camden anymore, no matter how much she wanted to, no matter how much she wished she could give birth right there in that wooden house with her father in the next room. The star-shaped crack on her bedroom ceiling, and the smell of the sea coming through the window every morning. But her daughter needed a hospital, needed doctors, needed things a carpenter grandfather's love couldn't replace. Her cousin Randall, who had taken Margot's case without charging her because he said family didn't take money from family, called 2 days later with news. He had found a cheap apartment for rent in South Boston, on the second floor of an old brick building right above a small Italian bakery. The landlord was an elderly Italian woman who liked renting to people with small children because she hated seeing the apartment empty. The rent was unusually low, so low that Margot asked twice to make sure Randall hadn't made a mistake. Margot didn't want to use Barrett's money. The $75,000 was still sitting in her old account, untouched, undecided, because every time she thought about that money, she heard his calm voice saying, "That's enough," as if she and her daughter were a bill to be paid. But her savings were down to only a few thousand, and she was 8 months pregnant, and her mother's words echoed back through Walter's story. Pride doesn't keep your daughter warm. She used her savings to pay 2 months of rent in advance, and began taking a few small product photography jobs online. scattered orders for online shops that needed pictures of jewelry or children's clothing, work that didn't pay much but was enough to remind her that she still had her hands, still had her eye, still had the ability to support herself. Barrett's money stayed untouched in the account, like a question she wasn't ready to answer. Walter drove her down to Boston on an early October morning. He brought her 2 suitcases of clothes, her old camera, and the unfinished white oak cradle wrapped in blankets in the back of the truck because he said he would finish it when he came down to visit. The apartment was small, with large windows overlooking a narrow street, and the first thing Margot felt when she stepped inside wasn't the light or the old wooden floor, but the smell of flour and butter and rising yeast drifting up from downstairs through the cracks in the floor, warm and sweet and alive, the smell of something being kneaded into shape. She stood in the middle of the empty apartment, one hand on her belly, breathed in, and thought this was the worst place she had ever lived, compared with the penthouse in Back Bay. But it was also the first place where she didn't feel as if she were living in someone else's home. Walter stayed one night, sleeping on the living room floor because there was no spare bed yet, then drove back to Camden the next morning. Before leaving, he stood at the door, looked at his daughter, and said, "I'll come down every month. You need anything, you call, anytime." Then he left, and Margot stood at the window watching the old pickup disappear at the end of the street. And she felt lonely in the way only people trying to become strong can feel. That afternoon, there was a knock at the door. Margot opened it and saw a 68-year-old woman, short, with silver hair twisted into a bun high on her head, wearing a white apron dusted with flour, her black eyes bright and sharp as a hawk's. She was holding a small, steaming pot in both hands, and she said in a thick Italian accent mixed with English, without smiling, without polite small talk, "I'm Agnese. I'm downstairs. The baby needs hot food. Eat. When you're done, leave the pot outside the door. I'll take it." Then she placed the pot of soup into Margot's hands, turned around, and went down the stairs, her slippers dragging against the wooden steps with a soft clatter, without looking back. Margot stood in the doorway, holding the hot pot of soup, breathing in the scent of tomato and basil and something she couldn't name, but that felt like the care of a stranger who needed no reason to be kind. She finished the whole pot of soup that night. She left the pot outside the door, and the next morning, when the pot had disappeared and the smell of toasted bread rose again from downstairs, Margot understood that even though she knew nothing about the woman named Agnese had decided that she and the baby inside her belonged here. It happened on a Thursday afternoon, 2 weeks after Margot moved into the apartment above the bakery. She had just come back from her regular blood pressure check at the clinic 6 blocks from home. The doctor said the numbers were more stable now, but they still needed to be monitored every week, and Margot walked home through the fading October light, holding a paper bag with the bottle of vitamins the doctor had prescribed, her 8-month pregnant belly heavy beneath her father's thin coat, which she still wore because it was wide enough to cover her stomach, and because it smelled of pine wood. She turned onto the bakery's street when she realized someone was following her. A man, walking fast, a camera hanging in front of his chest, called her name from behind. "Margot Langford? Margot, do you have any comment on Barrett Langford's wedding? Did you know Genevieve Ashworth before this? Has Barrett Langford contacted you since the news was announced?" Margot didn't turn around. She lowered her face, walked faster, one hand cradling her belly, her heart pounding hard, because she had managed to avoid this for weeks in Camden. But Boston was different. In Boston, the Langford name was in the newspapers, on the financial news, on the technology news sites, and someone among the reporters had found out where she lived, though she didn't understand how. The reporter moved faster, lifted his camera, and kept taking photos, the flash bursting in the dusk. "Margot, just one question. Are you planning to sue Mr. Langford? Did you know he's filed for divorce?" Margot stepped onto the front stoop of Agnese's bakery, the old brick steps she had walked over every day for 2 weeks without noticing that the second brick from the bottom was loose, and her foot slipped. She lost her balance, her pregnant belly pulling her forward, the bottle of vitamins falling from her hand, the paper bag tearing open, and in the instant when she thought she was going to fall, that she was going to fall face first onto the brick steps with her 8-month-old daughter inside her, a hand caught her by the elbow, firm, quick, not rough, but not gentle either. That hand held her steady, then let go almost immediately, as if the person didn't want to touch her any longer than necessary. Margot straightened, her heart still racing, and turned to look at the man who had caught her. He was standing right in front of Agnese's bakery, as if he had been there even before she turned onto the street. A man around 33 years old, tall, with short black hair, brown eyes so dark they were almost black, wearing a dark leather jacket, with a faint scar running along the left side of his jaw, an old scar, healed long ago, but still clear enough to be seen beneath the streetlight that had just come on. He didn't look at Margot. His eyes were fixed directly on the reporter behind her, and Margot didn't understand what it was in that gaze that made a grown man holding a professional camera slowly lower it, step back once, then twice, then turn and walk away without another word. No threat, no aggressive gesture. The dark-haired man only looked, and the reporter simply left, and Margot stood there on the stoop with her pregnant belly and the broken vitamin bottle at her feet, trying to understand what had just happened. Then the man turned to her, and he said in a deep, calm voice, neither warm nor cold, only practical, "Careful with the step. It's loose." Then he went into the bakery. He didn't ask who she was. He didn't ask whether she was all right. He didn't wait for her to thank him. The bakery door closed behind him, and Margot stood alone on the loose step, listening to her own heart beat so fast, she wasn't sure whether it was because she had almost fallen or because of something else, something she didn't yet have a name for. That night, when Agnès brought up a plate of warm bread with butter and a small jar of jam because she said, "The baby needs butter. Butter is good for the brain," Margot asked, trying to make her voice sound normal. "The man outside the bakery this afternoon, who is he?" Agnès was wiping her hands on her apron, and she stopped for 1 second, looking at Margot with those sharp black eyes that Margot now realized were exactly like the man's eyes, then said, briefly, without explanation, "My son, he's very busy, but he's a good boy." She turned and went back down the stairs, her slippers clattering against the wood, and Margot sat alone in the small apartment, eating bread and butter, breathing in the smell of flour rising from downstairs, and thinking about a hand that had caught her elbow at the exact moment she was about to fall, about a pair of dark brown eyes that hadn't looked at her but had looked straight at something behind her and made it disappear, about one single sentence so short it almost wasn't a sentence at all, and about the way that man had walked away without looking back, as if keeping a pregnant woman from falling on his mother's front steps was the most ordinary thing in the world, something no one needed to thank him for. The following week, strange things began to happen, and Margot couldn't explain a single one of them. The first thing was that the reporters disappeared. Not just the man who had chased her the day before, but all of them, every unfamiliar face with a camera who had lingered at the end of the street, sat in cars across from the bakery, or stood pretending to read a phone outside the clinic, where Margot had her blood pressure checked every Tuesday. One morning they were still there, and by that afternoon they were gone, completely gone, as if someone had drawn an invisible line around the neighborhood and said that no one was allowed to step inside it. Margot asked Randall over the phone, and her cousin said he had heard a rumor that the reporters had received some kind of legal notice connected to harassment laws involving pregnant women, but he didn't know who had sent it. He wasn't the one who sent it, and he advised Margot to treat it as good news and not ask too many questions. The second thing happened 3 days later. Margot was sitting inside Agnès' bakery in the afternoon, eating a plate of warm focaccia that Agnès had put in front of her without asking whether she wanted it, because Agnès never asked. She simply set food down and looked at Margot until she ate. The bakery door opened, and a man walked in wearing a gray suit, carrying a black leather briefcase, his hair slicked back smooth, smelling of expensive cologne, the kind of man Margot recognized immediately because she had lived in Barrett's world long enough to know what rich people's lawyers looked like. The man sat down at the counter, placed an envelope on its surface, and told Agnès he needed to see Miss Margot Kessler, that he represented Mr. Barrett Langford, that all she had to do was sign the confidentiality agreement inside this envelope, and everything would be over, that this was the last time his client would ask politely. Agnès didn't answer. She looked at the man with her sharp black eyes, then kept wiping the counter as if he were a stain on the glass. Margot sat at the corner table, her hand gripping the edge of her plate, not knowing whether she should stand up or stay seated, when the bakery door opened again. Another man walked in, 36 years old, broad, with a shaved head, wearing a black coat, his face flat and expressionless as a concrete wall. He didn't look at Margot. He didn't look at Agnès. He went straight to the counter, pulled out the stool right next to Barrett's lawyer, sat down, took a morning newspaper from the pocket of his coat, opened to the sports page, and began to read. Not one word. The lawyer glanced over. The bald man didn't look back. He only kept reading, slowly, calmly, as if he were sitting in his own living room on a Sunday morning. But there was something in the way he sat, in his absolute silence, in the distance he chose, close enough that their elbows almost touched, that made the lawyer slowly fold the envelope, slowly stand up, and slowly walk out of the bakery without saying another word. He never came back. The envelope stayed on the counter. The bald man finished reading the sports page, folded the paper, stood, gave Agnès a small nod, and walked out the door. Agnès picked up the envelope, dropped it into the trash beneath the counter, then went back to wiping the glass as though nothing had happened. Margot would later learn that the bald man's name was Trask Moreno, that he was 36 years old, and that he was the right hand of Agnès' son. But on that afternoon, all she knew was that a stranger had sat down to read the newspaper and made Barrett Langford's lawyer leave without ever opening his mouth. The third thing was the smallest, but it was the one that kept Margot awake all night. One evening, she came home, turned her key, and realized the lock was different, newer, heavier, stronger than the old one that had been rusted and jammed every time it rained. She hadn't called a locksmith. She hadn't told anyone. She hadn't asked Randall or Walter or anyone else to change the lock. The next morning, she asked Agnès, and the old woman was kneading dough, her hands white with flour, her eyes fixed on the mass of dough as though it were the most important thing in the world. And she said, "The old lock was broken. No need to thank me." Margot stood at the counter, watching her knead, and asked, her voice soft but clear, "Miss Agnès, do you know who's doing all these things? The reporters disappearing, the lawyer leaving, the lock being changed. Who's doing all of this?" Agnès didn't look up. She kept kneading the dough, steady and patient, then said in a calm voice, as if she were talking about the weather, "In this neighborhood, having someone look after you is normal. Don't ask too much. Just eat the soup." Margot didn't ask anything else. She went upstairs, closed the apartment door, locked it with the new lock she didn't know who had put there, and sat on her bed, one hand on her belly, looking out the large window where the South Boston streetlights spilled in. And she knew in a vague but certain way, that Agnès' son, the dark-haired man with the scar along his jaw, whom she had met exactly once and heard say exactly one sentence, was protecting her. She didn't know why. She didn't know who he truly was. She only knew that for the first time since hearing that news report on the television in the ultrasound room, she felt as if there was an invisible wall between her and the outside world, and someone had built that wall without waiting for her permission. At 2:00 in the morning on a late October night, Margot woke because her back hurt so badly she couldn't lie in any position without groaning. Her daughter had grown large enough that every movement pressed into her spine, and tonight the baby had decided not to sleep, kicking constantly, turning and shifting, as if there were a party going on inside her mother's belly, and Margot hadn't been invited. Margot sat up, rubbed her back, looked at the clock, then remembered the refrigerator upstairs had been out of milk since the afternoon, and Agnès had given her the key to the bakery refrigerator the week before, saying, "You come down and take whatever you need. My refrigerator isn't locked to you," handing over the key the way Agnès did everything, firmly, without thanks needed, without explanation needed. Margot put on her father's coat, slipped into her slippers, and went down the stairs in the dark. But when she reached the ground floor, the bakery kitchen wasn't dark. The lights were still on, yellow light spilling through the frosted glass door that connected the kitchen to the counter, and Margot heard metal striking metal, then a sound like someone drawing breath through clenched teeth because of pain. She pushed open the kitchen door. Zane Castellano was sitting on a low stool beside the stainless steel table. In front of him, the industrial dough mixer had been partly taken apart, screws and mixing blades scattered across the table, and his right hand was bleeding. Not a lot, but enough for Margot to see the red streak running from his palm to his wrist where the mixing blade had cut him as he removed it. He was trying to bandage himself with his left hand, the roll of gauze trapped between his knees and his uninjured hand, but one hand couldn't wrap it properly. The bandage kept slipping, loose and useless, and he had to start again. While Margot stood in the kitchen doorway, watching the man everyone in South Boston seemed to fear, in silence wrestle with a roll of gauze, like a child trying to tie a shoelace with one hand. She didn't ask. She didn't say, "Are you all right?" She didn't say, "Let me help." She only walked over, pulled out a chair across from him, took the roll of gauze from his hand, and began to wrap it. Her hand touched his skin for the first time, her palm cold from coming down the stairs in the night, his hand warm and rough, with calluses in places Margot didn't want to think about, but in that moment she didn't think about that. She only thought about wrapping the bandage evenly, tight enough, not so loose it would slip, not so tight it would make his hand go numb, the way her mother had taught her to bandage wounds when she was little, on the days she slipped while climbing trees in the backyard in Camden, and her mother sat on the porch steps, wrapping her up with the same hands cancer would later take away. She finished wrapping, let go of his hand, sat back in her chair. Zane looked at the bandaged hand, then at her, and in those dark brown eyes Margot saw something she hadn't expected. Not surprise, not gratitude, but a flicker of something almost like confusion, as if he wasn't used to anyone touching him without wanting something from him. Then he turned toward the table, picked up a cannoli from the tray of cooled evening pastries Agnes hadn't had time to put away, and pushed it across the table toward her. Consider it payment. Margot took the cannoli. She ate. He sat across from her and began putting the dough mixer back together with one hand, because the other had just been bandaged. They didn't talk. There was no long conversation about life, about Barrett, about why she was sitting in his mother's bakery at 2 o'clock in the morning, with an 8-month pregnant belly and dark circles under her eyes from sleeplessness. Zane didn't ask. He didn't ask anything. And Margot realized that his silence wasn't indifference. It was respect. His way of saying she didn't owe him any story. 15 minutes passed in silence, with only the sound of screws being tightened and Margot chewing the cannoli. Then she stood, took the bottle of milk from the refrigerator, the very reason she had come downstairs and nearly forgotten. She walked toward the kitchen door, and Zane said, still without looking up from the mixer, "Wait." He stood, went to the counter, picked up one of the bakery's small cards, the kind Agnes kept out for customers, then turned it over, took a pen from his pocket, and wrote 2 phone numbers. He placed the card on the table and pushed it toward Margot. "Top number is a lawyer. No one can buy him. Bottom number is mine, in case it's urgent." Margot looked at the card, looked at the 2 numbers written in hard, slanted, practical handwriting, then looked at him. He had already sat back down and gone on assembling the mixer, as if he had just given her a plumber's business card instead of a line into his world. She took the card, slipped it into the pocket of her father's coat, and went upstairs. That night, Margot stuck the card to the refrigerator door with the fish-shaped magnet Agnes had left in the apartment, then lay down in bed, pulled the blanket up, and for the first time in weeks, she slept deeply, without dreams, without waking halfway through, as if something in the air had changed, as if 2 handwritten phone numbers on the back of a bakery card had become a promise no one needed to speak aloud. In her 34th week, Margot sat in the familiar clinic waiting room, waiting for her regular blood pressure check, and reached for a magazine on the rack beside her chair to pass the time, because she had learned not to look at her phone anymore, not to read the news anymore, not to search for the name Barrett Langford anymore, because every time she did, her blood pressure rose, and Dr. Marsh called with a worried voice she tried to hide. The magazine was a thick fashion magazine, the kind clinics always seem to have on their shelves with worn spines, and Margot flipped through a few pages without really looking, until she turned to a page with a full-page photograph that made her hand stop before her mind could process what her eyes were seeing. Genevieve Ashworth, her blonde hair falling in perfect waves, wearing a cream dress as she sat in a blue velvet armchair in a room that was clearly inside the Martha's Vineyard estate, and the interview headline running elegantly beside her in italic letters, Genevieve Ashworth, Love, Family, and a New Chapter with Barrett Langford. Margot should have turned the page. She knew she should have turned the page, but her eyes stuck to the paper as if someone had glued them there, and she read, line by line, slowly, until she reached the part where Genevieve told the reporter, with a radiant smile Margot could imagine even from a still photograph, "Barrett and I want to build a family. He's never had a child. This will be the first time for both of us, and we're looking forward to it more than anything." Never had a child. Margot read those words again. Never had a child. She was sitting here, 34 weeks pregnant, Barrett Langford's daughter alive and kicking inside her, and the woman about to marry him had just said in a national magazine that he had never had a child, as if Margot didn't exist, as if the baby in her belly didn't exist, as if both of them had been erased from Barrett Langford's history by one elegant interview line in a glossy magazine. Margot closed the magazine, turned it face down, placed it back on the rack, and clenched both hands over her belly until her knuckles went white, and she said nothing, didn't cry, only sat there, staring straight at the white wall across from her, breathing slowly, counting each breath. 1, 2, 3, 4, the way Dr. Marsh had taught her to control her blood pressure whenever she felt as though she might break apart. 3 days later, Randall called, and this time her cousin's voice wasn't calm. He said Barrett's lawyer had just filed for full custody, and Margot thought she must have misheard, because Barrett had never wanted this baby. He hadn't even asked whether the baby was a boy or a girl during their last call, so why would he be suing for custody? Randall went on, his voice growing heavier, saying this wasn't Barrett's idea, it was Genevieve's. The Ashworth family didn't want any thread tying Barrett to his old life, and the baby was the last thread. Genevieve wanted Margot erased completely, not because she wanted to raise Barrett's child, but because she didn't want Barrett to have any reason to stay in contact with his former wife. And to do that, Barrett had hired a private investigator. Randall said the investigator had been following Margot for weeks, taking photos of people entering and leaving Agnes's bakery, taking photos of Zane Castellano, and Barrett was building a court file with the argument that Margot lived in an area connected to people outside the law, that her living environment wasn't safe for a small child, that she didn't have the financial stability or living conditions to raise a baby alone. Randall stopped for 1 second, then said in a voice Margot recognized as the voice of a lawyer trying not to panic. Margot, if you keep staying close to the Castellano family, Barrett will use that in court. He has photos. He has names. And in Massachusetts, family court judges are very sensitive to files like this. Margot hung up, set the phone down on the kitchen table, and sat perfectly still for a long time. Her daughter kicked inside her, hard, again and again, as if the baby could sense her mother's heart beating too fast. And for the first time since hearing that news report on the television in the ultrasound room, for the first time since hearing Barrett say, "Sign the papers," in that calm voice, for the first time since sitting on that freezing stone bench outside the hospital lobby, Margot felt afraid. Not afraid for herself. She had stopped being afraid for herself a long time ago. She was afraid for her daughter. She was afraid that the man who hadn't even bothered to ask whether his child was a boy or a girl would use that very child as a weapon to erase her from the map. And she was afraid that she wasn't strong enough, didn't have enough money, didn't have a good enough lawyer to stop him. Margot didn't sleep that night. She sat at the small kitchen table in the apartment, the lights off, with only the streetlight spilling through the large window and the faint smell of flour drifting up from downstairs, where Agnes had turned off the ovens long ago. She sat there and thought about every choice she had, and every choice led to a wall. Randall had referred her to a colleague licensed to practice in Massachusetts, a family lawyer in Cambridge whom Randall said was good. But the man declined after 2 days, politely, briefly, saying his schedule was full. Randall called the second person, then the third, then the fourth, and the answers were so alike that Randall finally had to tell Margot plainly that their schedules weren't full. It was that no one in Boston wanted to stand across from Langford Capital's legal team, because Barrett didn't just have the money to hire the best lawyers. He had the money to make life extremely difficult for any lawyer who dared to fight him, and in this city, everyone knew it. The next morning, before Agnese opened the bakery, when the sky was still dim and the South Boston street was still wet with dew, Margot went downstairs, sat at the corner table in the bakery, and waited. She didn't know for certain whether Zane would come, but she had watched long enough to know that he stopped by his mother's bakery every early morning before work, took a brown paper bag and an espresso Agnese had already prepared, then disappeared into the day without saying more than 2 or 3 sentences. He arrived at 6:15. The door opened, the cold November air rushed in, and Zane stepped over the threshold in his familiar black leather jacket, stopping when he saw Margot sitting at the corner table. He looked at her for 1 second, then went to the counter to take the espresso Agnese had set out for him. He didn't ask why she was here at 6 o'clock in the morning. He simply took the espresso, walked to her table, pulled out the chair across from her, sat down, and waited. Margot looked straight into his eyes, those dark brown eyes she had first seen on the loose stoop 1 month earlier, and she said, without circling around it, without an opening, "My husband is using the fact that I live near you to fight for custody in court. He has photographs. He has your name. He's building a case saying I live near dangerous people and that I'm not fit to raise my child. Did you know about this?" Zane took a sip of espresso, set the cup down, and said, "I knew." 1 word, Margot waited, but he didn't say anything more, and she understood that he hadn't only known, he had known before she did. Maybe since the first private investigator appeared at the end of the street, maybe even before that, because this was his neighborhood, and no one entered his neighborhood without him knowing. "Why didn't you tell me?" Margot asked, and she heard her own voice come out sharper than she had meant it to. Zane looked at her, and for the first time, Margot saw him weighing his words, saw him choosing each one carefully before he spoke. "Because I wanted you to decide for yourself when you were ready to hear it, and because I wanted to give you a choice, not hand you one more fear." He placed both hands on the table, his right hand still carrying the bandage she had wrapped the night before, and he spoke in a steady, clear voice, not too warm and not cold, the voice of a man used to giving people choices and understanding that every choice had a price. "You have two roads. 1. You move out. Leave this apartment. Leave this neighborhood. Cut contact with me and my mother. Move somewhere clean that Barrett can't pick apart. He loses his evidence, loses his file. You live normally, find a normal lawyer, and fight the case normally." He stopped. 2. You stay. I introduce you to a lawyer Barrett Langford can't buy, can't scare, can't touch, because he doesn't live in the world Barrett is used to. He lives in mine, and he'll handle this case for you. Zane looked at her, and his voice lowered half a tone. "But you have to understand. Choosing the second road means Barrett will know whose side you're standing on, and he won't like that." Silence. The clock on the bakery wall ticked. The smell of espresso. The smell of flour. Margot looked down at her 34-week belly, where her daughter was unusually quiet that morning, as if the baby were listening too. She said, "I need to think." Zane nodded. He stood, picked up his espresso, and walked out the door without looking back. The way he always did. The way Margot was beginning to understand was how he gave her space without needing to say it out loud. Margot went upstairs. She sat in the apartment all day, eating nothing, only drinking milk and thinking. By evening, she called Walter. He listened as she told him everything, didn't interrupt, didn't breathe hard, only listened, so silent that Margot had to ask, "Dad, are you still there?" And Walter said, "I'm here. Keep telling me." When she finished, the silence stretched for a very long time, longer than any silence Margot had ever heard from her father. And then Walter said, his voice slow and heavy, each word measured as if he were judging a board by eye, "You're asking me, so I'll say this. I don't trust any man whose hand I haven't shaken. That's my rule. But I trust my daughter. I trust your head, trust your gut, trust the way you see people. Whatever you choose, I'm behind you. Anytime, anywhere." Margot hung up. She sat a while longer, her hand on her belly, feeling her daughter kick, soft and steady, as if the baby were saying, "Mommy, we're going to be okay. You decide." The next morning, at 6:15, Margot went down to the bakery. Zane was at the counter, holding his espresso, punctual as he was every day. He looked at her. She looked at him, and she said 4 words, without trembling, without hesitation. "Give me the lawyer's number." Zane didn't smile. He didn't nod. He only set down his cup, took out his phone, and called. And Margot stood in his mother's bakery at 6:15 in the morning, 34 weeks pregnant, the smell of flour all around her, and she knew she had chosen, not because of Zane, not because of love, not because she wanted to step into his world, but because her daughter needed a mother brave enough to stand up. And to stand up, sometimes you had to take the hand the world told you not to hold. It happened on a Thursday afternoon in early December, when snow had begun falling over Boston from the early morning, and by 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the South Boston street was covered in a thin white layer that made everything feel strangely quiet. So quiet that Margot could hear the snow touching the apartment window, like someone tapping lightly with the tips of their fingers. Walter had gone back to Camden the day before, after spending 3 days visiting her and taking the unfinished oak cradle with him because he said he wanted to finish it properly in his own woodworking shop and promised to bring it back once it was done. Phoebe was in Portland, busy with a large wedding flower order for the weekend. Agnes's bakery had closed early at 2 o'clock because of the snowstorm. Agnes had gone home, and Margot was alone in the small apartment above the empty bakery, in her 37th week, her belly so large now that she couldn't see her own feet anymore, her back aching constantly, her legs swollen. But Dr. Marsh had said her blood pressure was more stable than last week, and that all she needed to do was rest, take her medicine, and wait. Margot was sitting on the sofa, one hand resting on her belly, watching the snow fall through the large window when it hit her. The dizziness came first, strong and sudden, as if someone had turned the room 90 degrees, the ceiling becoming the wall, the floor becoming the ceiling, and Margot had to grip the sofa arm to keep herself from falling. Then came the pain, deep, low, different from the backaches she had grown used to. This pain began in her lower belly and spread through her whole body like a wave, and Margot knew, with the instinct of a woman who had once lost a child, with the fear she had hidden at the bottom of her heart for the past 9 months, that something was wrong. She pulled out her phone, called Dr. Marsh, her hand shaking so badly she had to dial twice, and when the doctor answered, Margot could only say, "Dr. Marsh, I'm very dizzy, and my stomach hurts. I think something's wrong." Dr. Marsh's voice changed at once, from a conversational voice into the voice Margot recognized as a doctor entering emergency mode, calm but sharp, each word clear. "Margot, listen to me. Go to the hospital right now. Don't drive. Call a taxi, or call someone to take you. I'll call ahead to my colleague in the emergency department. Go now." Margot called a taxi. The app on her phone showed there were no cars in the area because of the bad weather. She called a taxi company by phone, waited through 4 rings, and then a woman's voice told her the wait would be at least 45 minutes because of the snowstorm and the shortage of drivers. 45 minutes. The pain came again, stronger than before, and Margot bent forward on the sofa, both hands wrapped around her belly, breathing through her mouth, trying not to panic because Dr. Marsh had said panic would raise her blood pressure, and higher blood pressure would make everything worse. She looked out the window, down at the snow-white street, at the dark front of Agnes's bakery because it had already closed, no one there, no lights on, and she felt lonely in a way she had never felt before. Lonely down to the bone, because for the first time, she understood that true loneliness wasn't having no one love you. It was needing help more than ever, and having no one there. Then her eyes stopped on the refrigerator door, on the fish-shaped magnet, on the small bakery card stuck beneath it. She stood up slowly, one hand gripping the back of the chair, then the edge of the table, then the side of the refrigerator, moving step by step through the tiny apartment, a distance that usually took 5 seconds but now took a full minute. She pulled down the card, turned it over, looked at the 2 phone numbers written in hard, slanted handwriting, and dialed the lower number. His number. The number for emergencies. Zane answered after half a ring, as if he had been holding the phone in his hand, and Margot said 3 sentences, her voice trembling but clear. "I need to get to the hospital. Something's wrong. There's no taxi." Half a second of silence. Then Zane said 2 words. 3 minutes. And he hung up. Margot stood in the middle of the apartment, one hand gripping the edge of the kitchen table, and counted. She counted every second, because she didn't know what else to do, because counting kept her awake, kept her standing, kept her from thinking about the last time, the time she lost her first baby in a Boston hospital while Barrett was in London and didn't answer his phone, and she lay alone in a hospital bed watching the doctor shake his head. She counted to 180 when she heard a car stop in front of the bakery. Exactly 3 minutes. She went down the stairs, holding the railing, one step at a time, and when she reached the bakery door, Trask Moreno was already standing there, holding the car door open, snow clinging to his shaved head, his face expressionless, but his eyes moving from her belly to her face, to the stairs behind her, quick, assessing, as though he were checking whether she could walk on her own or needed to be carried. Margot climbed into the car by herself. Zane was sitting in the back seat. He had taken off his black leather jacket and spread it over the seat because the car seat was cold. And when Margot sat down, she felt the warmth from the jacket he had just been wearing seep into her back through the fabric. And she almost cried because of that small detail, because in the middle of everything falling apart, there was a man who had thought about the cold car seat and taken off his coat so she wouldn't have to sit on frozen leather with a 9-month pregnant belly. Trask drove through the snow, fast but steady, and Margot sat in the back seat, not speaking, not looking at Zane, only holding his hand, holding tight, holding one of his hands with both of hers, and she held on not because of love, not because of trust, but because of pure fear, because she was terrified of losing her daughter, and his hand was the only thing keeping her from falling into panic. Zane let her hold on. He didn't say it would be all right. He didn't tell her not to be afraid. He only used his other hand to tap lightly against the back of her hand. Steady, slow, tap, 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 like the beat of a calm heart, as if he were teaching her how to breathe by giving her another rhythm to listen to, slower than her own frantic heartbeat. And Margot began to breathe with that tapping rhythm, inhaling when he tapped, exhaling when he paused. And she didn't know how he knew to do this, but it kept her alive through the 12-minute drive across snowstorm-covered Boston. At the hospital, everything happened fast. Dr. Marsh's colleague was already waiting. Margot was placed on a stretcher, pushed into the emergency department, and she heard words she didn't fully understand but understood enough to know that she had been right. Something was wrong, and the doctors needed to intervene early, and her daughter would be born today even though it wasn't her due date yet. When the emergency room doors closed, and Margot looked up at the hospital ceiling through her tears, the last thing she heard before the doors shut all the way was Zane's voice in the hallway, speaking into the phone, calm and clear. "Mr. Kessler, this is Zane. Your daughter is at the hospital. The baby is about to be born. Come now." Then, "Phoebe, this is Zane, Margot's friend. She's at the hospital. Come now." Then, "Ma, I'm at the hospital. Margot's about to give birth. Come." 3 phone calls, none longer than 15 seconds. And Margot thought, before the medication began to work and the hospital ceiling blurred above her, that this was the man of the fewest words she had ever met. But when it mattered, he knew exactly what to say, who to say it to, and when to say it. Out in the maternity ward hallway, time moved in the private way it does for people who are waiting, slower than any clock, heavier than any silence. Agnese Castellano sat on a white plastic chair beneath the fluorescent lights, her back straight, both hands resting in her lap, and she was praying. Her voice was so quiet that only the person sitting beside her could hear it. Low, steady Italian, the prayers she had been saying for 40 years, ever since her husband died, ever since she raised her son alone in a South Boston neighborhood where no one dared touch her bakery, and her fingers moved over the olive wood rosary beads her mother had brought from Sicily to America in 1968, bead by bead, as steady as breathing. Trask stood at the end of the hallway, his back against the wall, both arms folded across his chest, his face expressionless, his eyes fixed straight on the emergency room door, and he stood so still that a nurse passing by thought he was hospital security. But Zane couldn't sit. For the first time since Margot had known him, for the first time since she had seen him standing in front of his mother's bakery and making a reporter leave with nothing but one look, Zane Castellano couldn't keep calm. He paced up and down the hallway, from one end to the other. Long strides, hands shoved into his pockets, jaw clenched tight, the scar along the left side of his jaw more visible than usual, because the muscle there was locked, and every time he passed Agnese's chair, she looked up from her rosary and looked at her son with those sharp black eyes, but she said nothing, because she understood that there were fears even a mother couldn't soothe, and the fear her son was carrying right now was the kind of fear she had never seen in him before. At 6:12 in the evening, the door opened, and a female doctor in a blue gown stepped out, pulled down her mask, and said the 4 words the entire hallway had been waiting to hear. "Mother and baby are healthy." Agnese closed her eyes, her lips moving through one final prayer. Then she opened them, and for the first time, Margot wasn't there to see it. But Phoebe would later tell her that Miss Agnes smiled, a small, private smile, lifting only one corner of her mouth, but it was a smile. Trask lowered his arms from his chest and released one long breath, and Zane stopped in the middle of the hallway, standing still, looking down at the floor, both hands still in his pockets. And no one saw his face in that moment because his head was bowed, but Agnese knew, because she was his mother, and mothers always know. Corinne Marguerite Kessler was born at 6:12 that evening, weighing 5 pounds and 15 ounces, smaller than usual, because she had arrived 3 weeks early, with soft, curly black hair, her eyes squeezed shut, and her first cry rang through the emergency room like a small bell, calling the whole world to stop and listen. She needed to be monitored for 2 more days, but the doctor said she was healthy. Her lungs were good, her heart was good, and Margot, when she woke in the hospital bed with swollen eyes and a body so exhausted she couldn't lift her hand, didn't say, "Where am I?" or "What happened?" The first thing she said, in a hoarse voice thin as thread, was, "Is my baby all right?" The nurse said the baby was healthy, the baby was being monitored, and in a few minutes, they would bring her in. Margot closed her eyes, and tears slipped down both sides of her temples into her hair. exactly the way she had cried on the ultrasound table more than 2 months earlier, when she heard her daughter's heartbeat for the first time. But this time the tears were different. This time there was no television playing the news. No anchor's voice cutting through the room, only the steady beeping of the heart monitor and the bright white hospital lights, and the truth that her daughter had arrived. Her daughter was alive. Her daughter was breathing with her own lungs in this world. At 10 o'clock that night, the hospital room door opened, and Walter Kessler walked in, his coat wet with snow, flakes still clinging to his silver hair before they could melt, his boots muddy from the road, his face red from driving 4 hours through the snowstorm on the highway from Camden down to Boston. And he went straight to his daughter's bed, looked at Margot lying there with swollen eyes and the most exhausted smile he had ever seen. And he said nothing. Walter Kessler, the quietest man Margot had ever known. The man who had raised her with the sound of a wood plane, warm meals, and patient silence, knelt beside the bed, pressed his forehead to his daughter's hand, and stayed there for a long time. So long that Margot thought he had fallen asleep. But no, he was crying, silently, without a sound, tears soaking into the back of her hand, and Margot placed her other hand on her father's head, stroking his snow-damp silver hair, and for the first time since her mother died, she cared for her father instead of letting him care for her. At midnight, Phoebe arrived. She appeared in the hospital room doorway with red-rimmed eyes, her coat buttoned wrong, her reddish-brown curls dusted with snow, and in her hand she held a small vase of flowers, the only bouquet she had managed to throw together before rushing out of her shop in Portland. A few white chrysanthemums and several eucalyptus stems, though half of them had already wilted from 2 hours in the cold car. Phoebe placed the vase on the hospital room windowsill, looked at it for 1 second, then looked at Margot and said, in a voice that was half crying and half laughing, the way only Phoebe could manage at the same time, "The flowers look terrible, but I'm here." Margot laughed. For the first time on the longest day of her life, she laughed. And that laugh was small and weak and hoarse, but it was real. And Phoebe climbed onto the bed beside her, careful to avoid the IV line, and the 2 friends from high school lay side by side in the hospital bed while Walter slept, slumped in the chair in the corner, and out in the hallway. On another white plastic chair, Zane Castellano remained, keeping watch until morning. The next day, in the afternoon, the doctor said Corinne had stabilized and could leave the observation unit. The nurse tucked her into the hospital's pale pink blanket and brought her to Margot's room. And when the nurse placed Corinne in her arms, when Margot felt the weight of her daughter resting on her chest for the first time, that tiny, warm weight, lighter than the camera she still carried every day, yet heavier than anything she had ever held in her life, she cried. Not the way she had cried on the stone bench outside the hospital lobby, not the way she had cried when she heard Barrett say, "Sign the papers," in that calm voice. Not because of pain or fear or loss, but because she looked down at that tiny red face with soft, curly black hair and eyes squeezed shut, and that little mouth searching for her mother's warmth, and she thought that everything she had endured over the past 9 months, the news report on television, the crowded waiting room turning to stare, the ice-cold phone call, the magazine saying he had never had a child, the private investigator taking photographs, the snowstorm, the emergency stretcher, all of it had led here, to this moment, to these 5 pounds and 15 ounces of warmth against her chest, and it was worth it. Every painful second had been worth it. Agnes came to visit in the late afternoon, while Walter stepped into the hallway to call Phoebe, because Phoebe had had to drive back to Portland early that morning to open her shop, but still called every 2 hours for updates. She sat in the chair beside the bed, wearing a gray sweater instead of her usual white apron, her silver hair still twisted high in a bun, though a few strands had loosened around her ears, and she looked at Corinne in Margot's arms with those black eyes Margot had begun to know, sharp but not cold, the eyes of a woman who had seen too much in life to pretend to be gentle, but was gentle all the same in her own way. When Margot needed to rest because her body still ached after the intervention and the pain medicine made her drowsy, Agnes took Corinne, holding her with both hands roughened by 40 years of kneading dough, holding her firmly and naturally as if she had held this child all her life, and she sang her a song in Italian that Margot didn't understand, though from the melody she knew it was a lullaby, the kind Italian mothers had sung to their children and grandchildren for generations. Then Agnes said, her voice soft, her eyes on Corinne rather than on Margot, as if she were speaking to the baby more than to the baby's mother, "My son isn't a good man the way the world judges good men. I know that, I'm his mother. I'm not blind. I know what he does. I know what people call him. And I won't make excuses. But I also know he has never sat outside a hospital hallway all night for anyone before you. Never. She stopped, kissed Corinne lightly on the forehead, then lifted her eyes to Margot. So no matter what happens between you and him, whether you love my son or not, I want you to know one thing. You and this baby will always have a place in my bakery. Always. That isn't Zane's promise. It's mine. Margot looked at Agnès holding her daughter, and she understood that the older woman wasn't saying this because of her son. She was saying it because of Margot, because of Corinne, because she had decided from the day she carried that pot of soup up to the second floor that these two belonged under her roof, and that decision had nothing to do with Zane. It had to do with what Agnès Castellano believed more than anything else, that when a baby was born, someone had to guard her, and she would be one of those people no matter what the world said. That evening, after Agnès had gone home and Walter was sitting in the chair beside his granddaughter's bed reading the newspaper, Margot said to the nurse, "There's a man named Zane Castellano out in the hallway. Let him come in." The nurse looked at her, then looked at Walter, then went out into the hall. A minute later, Zane stepped inside. He stopped in the middle of the room and didn't come any closer, his dark brown eyes looking first at Walter sitting beside the bed, before turning to Margot. The two men looked at each other, the 58-year-old carpenter from a coastal town in Maine, and the 33-year-old boss of South Boston, two men with nothing in common except that both had stayed awake all night because of the same woman, and they nodded to each other, a short, wordless nod. But it was enough. Enough for Walter to rise from the chair, give up his seat, and step into the hallway with the newspaper, closing the door softly behind him. Zane sat down in the chair Walter had just left, and he looked at Corinne. Margot watched his face, the face she had seen stay calm when a reporter chased her with a camera, when Barrett's lawyer sat at the bakery counter, when she held his hand in the car during the snowstorm, and now that face changed completely. His jaw was still hard, the scar along the left side of his jaw still clear, but his eyes were wet, and Margot saw something in those dark brown eyes she had never seen in him before. Not weakness, but awe. The kind of awe people feel when they stand before something too large, too sacred, too perfect to believe is real. "She's so red," he said, his voice lower than usual, almost a whisper, and Margot nearly laughed because of all the things a person could say about a newborn. Zane Castellano chose to say she was too red. "Do you want to hold her?" Margot asked. Zane looked down at his hands, those large, rough hands, his right hand still carrying the faint scar from the dough mixer blade. Then he looked at Corinne, tiny and fragile in the pale pink blanket. Then he looked at Margot and said, "Next time, let me learn how to hold a baby first." Margot smiled, a real smile, warm and quiet, and she thought she had just watched a man all of South Boston feared admit that he was afraid to hold a 5-pound and 15-ounce baby. And somehow, that made her trust him more than any promise could have. That afternoon, Walter brought the oak cradle into the hospital room. He had driven it from Camden in the bed of his truck through the snowstorm, carefully covered to protect the wood, and now he set it beside Margot's bed, the cradle still unfinished but already strong enough for a baby to lie in, white oak smoothed by hand, the grain glowing beneath the hospital lights. Zane stood in the corner of the room, looking at the cradle. Then he stepped closer, reached out, and touched the wooden side, his fingers moving slowly along the grain as if he were reading something written in the wood. And he asked Walter, his voice low, "What kind of wood did you use?" Walter looked at him, looked at his hand on the side of the cradle, and the two men looked at each other for the second time that day. But this time it was different. This time it wasn't the greeting nod of two strangers, but the look of two men recognizing that they understood each other in a place no one else in the room did, in the place where wood was shaped by hand and patience was something taught, not spoken. "White oak," Walter said. "Next time I come down, I'll show you." And Margot, lying in the hospital bed with her daughter on her chest, watched her father and the man she didn't yet know what to call talking about wood beside a newborn's cradle, and she thought this was how men of few words began to trust each other. Not with promises, not with handshakes, but with wood, with the work of their hands, with something built to keep a baby safe. Phoebe Whitmore stayed for 5 days, and those 5 days were the days Margot learned that friendship wasn't beautiful words of comfort, but a 28-year-old woman sleeping on an old sofa, so narrow her legs hung over the edge, waking every 2 hours to the sound of Corinne crying, then crawling up in the dark to make formula even though she had never made formula for a newborn in her life. And the first time she did it, she added so much water that Margot had to throw it out and make it again, but didn't have the heart to say anything, because Phoebe was standing there with her eyes half open, half shut, her reddish-brown curls sticking straight up like a bush blown by the wind, trying her very best at something she didn't know how to do simply because she didn't want Margot to have to do it alone. Phoebe cooked, and Phoebe cooked badly, which wasn't a secret because Phoebe had been a bad cook since high school. She was the only person Margot had ever known who could burn boiling water and cook pasta into a solid lump stuck to the bottom of the pot like cement. But here, in the small apartment above the bakery, with Corinne lying in the oak cradle beside the bed, and Margot still aching after the intervention, Phoebe cooked 3 dishes for every meal, morning, noon, and night, without skipping a single one. She made scrambled eggs with yolks that were still runny, while the whites were burnt black. She made tomato soup and forgot to add salt, then made up for it by adding so much salt that Margot drank 2 glasses of water afterward. She made spaghetti with jarred sauce, pouring it straight from the jar into the pot before the pasta had even finished cooking. And the result was a plate of something Margot wasn't sure should be called pasta, or porridge, or a culinary crime. But Margot ate every meal, every plate, every bowl, every bite. Because Phoebe stood beside the table, with her arms crossed over her chest, staring at her, refusing to sit down and eat her own portion until Margot finished hers. And Margot knew that if she left even one bite behind, those wide green eyes would fill with tears, and she would rather eat burned eggs than watch Phoebe cry. Because if Phoebe cried, then Margot would cry too, and then Corinne would cry, and the whole small apartment would turn into a puddle of tears no one could possibly clean up. 5 days passed, and Phoebe had to go back to Portland because the flower shop couldn't stay closed forever. She had orders, bills, rent to pay on the storefront, and she had already stayed longer than she could afford financially. Something she didn't tell Margot, but Margot knew, because she understood Phoebe well enough to know that when her friends stopped checking her phone and stopped mentioning the flower shop, it meant she was trying not to think about what was waiting for her at home. On the 6th morning, before she left, while Margot was feeding Corinne on the sofa, Phoebe sat down beside her, pulled a small white envelope from the pocket of her coat, placed it on Margot's lap, and said, trying to sound normal though her lips trembled, "Open it after I'm gone. It's nothing big. I want her to have everything she needs." Margot picked up the envelope, light, thin, but with something inside beyond paper. She looked at Phoebe, and Phoebe looked away, out the window, biting her lip, because Phoebe Whitmore could cook badly, could cry as easily as rain, could talk so much that everyone in the flower shop had to ask her to be quiet for 10 seconds so they could choose flowers. But she didn't know how to accept thanks. She never had. After Phoebe carried her suitcase down the stairs, Margot opened the envelope. Inside was a check from Phoebe's flower shop savings account, $1,500, and a small scrap of paper torn from the shop's order book, written in blue ballpoint pen. In the familiar, messy handwriting, Margot had read across hundreds of letters and messages through 15 years of friendship. For diapers, for milk, and for joy. I love you. Margot looked at the check, looked at the number, and she knew how much $1,500 meant to a small flower shop in Portland, Maine. She knew it could be 1 month of storefront rent, could be 2 weeks of flower stock, could be something Phoebe couldn't give away without feeling pain somewhere in her bank account. But she had given it, because Phoebe Whitmore gave by not giving Margot the choice to refuse. "Open it after I'm gone." And Margot heard her mother's voice echo in her mind through her father's story. Pride doesn't keep your daughter warm. And she tucked the check into her wallet. She carried Corinne downstairs through the bakery and out to the door, where Phoebe was stuffing her suitcase into the trunk, the little green car she had driven through the snowstorm to get here. And Margot said, "I'll take it." Phoebe turned back, eyes red, lips pressed tight. "I didn't ask for your opinion. I know. I'll take it. Thank you." Then the 2 women hugged on the steps of Agnes's bakery, holding each other for a long time, holding tight, until Corinne, squeezed between them, began to fuss in protest. And they cried, then laughed because Corinne fussed, then cried again because crying was easier than saying goodbye. And when Phoebe finally let go, wiped her eyes with her sleeve, got into the car, closed the door, rolled down the window, and said, "I'll call when I get home," then drove away. Margot stood on the stoop, the loose stoop no one had fixed yet, holding her daughter, watching the little green car disappear at the end of the street, and she thought she was rich, not rich in money, but rich in a way Barrett Langford, with all his billions of dollars, would never understand, because she had a friend willing to give away 1 month of storefront rent to buy diapers for her daughter and write 3 words on a hastily torn scrap of paper, "I love you," as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. In February of the following year, on a Tuesday afternoon, Margot would remember forever, not because it was dramatic, not because she cried, not because anything grand happened, but because it was the afternoon when she realized that the end of one chapter of life sometimes arrives through a short phone call while you're changing your daughter's diaper. Corinne was 2 months old, much chubbier than she had been on the day she was born. Her curly black hair now long enough for Margot to clip back with the little flower-shaped barrette Phoebe had sent down from Portland, and she was lying on the changing table, squirming because she hated having her diaper changed, her face flushed red, both legs kicking nonstop, when Margot's phone vibrated on the kitchen table and she saw Randall's name on the screen. She tucked the phone between her shoulder and her ear, one hand holding Corinne, the other opening the diaper, and Randall spoke without starting with any polite question about how she was, because Randall was a lawyer, and when lawyers had important news, they said it directly. "Margot, the FBI has just opened an official investigation into Langford Capital. Money laundering. Large scale." Margot froze, her fingers still holding the edge of the diaper, looking down at Corinne, who was staring back at her with wide gray-blue eyes that knew nothing about the world beyond this small apartment. And she listened as Randall explained. After the story about Margot spread through the media a few months earlier, after the story of the pregnant wife abandoned in an ultrasound room became the headline every news site in Boston ran again and again, Barrett Langford's public image collapsed faster than his company's stock price. The wedding with Genevieve Ashworth was postponed indefinitely, because no church on Martha's Vineyard wanted the Langford name on an invitation that would appear on the front page of the papers, beside the word scandal. The Ashworth family panicked. They had bet everything on this marriage, on the Langford name, on Langford money. And when the ship began to sink, the Ashworth family did what wealthy families running out of money always do. They tried to pull their money out before everything fell apart. But they pulled it out in ways that weren't legal, through shell companies, through offshore accounts, and that unusual flow of money lit up federal financial monitoring systems like headlights in the dark. The FBI came knocking. And Genevieve Ashworth, the woman who had said in a magazine that Barrett had never had a child, the woman who had pushed the custody lawsuit to erase Margot from Barrett's life, cooperated with the FBI in exchange for immunity for her family. She handed over documents, emails, transaction records, everything the FBI needed to build a case against Barrett Langford, and she did it without looking back once, because Genevieve Ashworth, just like Barrett, had never truly loved anyone but herself. Barrett was detained for 72 hours, then released on bail, but the damage had already been done. Langford Capital's stock plunged. The board demanded that he resign. And most important to Margot, Randall said in a voice that, for the first time, carried something like relief. The custody case had completely collapsed. Barrett Langford, now under federal criminal investigation for money laundering, no longer had the legal standing to stand before a family court judge and claim someone else was unfit to raise a child. "Margot," Randall said, "you're free now. He has no grounds left to sue. This case is over." Margot hung up. She set the phone down on the kitchen table and looked at Corinne, still lying on the changing table. The baby had stopped squirming and was sucking on her finger, staring up at the ceiling with the endless curiosity only infants have. And Margot stood there for a very long time, looking at her daughter, not crying, not smiling, only standing, because she didn't know what she was supposed to feel. Not joy, not sadness, not satisfaction. Only a vast, empty space where fear had lived for months. And now that fear was gone, and she didn't yet know what to fill that space with. She finished changing Corinne's diaper, lifted her into her arms, and placed her in the white oak cradle Walter had finished, and brought down to Boston on his last visit. The cradle Zane had once touched along the wooden side and asked, "What kind of wood did you use?" Corinne lay in the cradle, looking up, sucking her finger, so peaceful that Margot wanted to cry just because of that peace. Then she stepped out onto the small balcony behind the apartment, a balcony barely big enough for one person to stand on, and looked down at the South Boston street beneath the February evening light. her breath turning into white mist in the cold air, and she stood there for 10 minutes, not thinking, only breathing, only watching, only feeling the cold against her face, and the truth that no one in this world had the right to take her daughter from her arms anymore. Then she went back inside, closed the balcony door, washed her hands, and made dinner. She made soup, the simple tomato soup Agnès had brought up to her on the first day she moved in, because Agnès had taught her the recipe the week before, and Margot cooked slowly, carefully, stirring the soup on the little stove in the little apartment, not telling anyone about Randall's call, not calling Walter, not calling Phoebe, not yet. She would call later, but for now she only cooked, because she had learned from Agnès that when the world changes too quickly, the best way to keep yourself standing is to do something with your hands. Slowly, patiently, the way Agnès had baked bread from 4 o'clock in the morning on the day after her husband died, and then the day after that, and then for the next 30 years, because if she stopped kneading dough, she would collapse, and Margot didn't collapse. Margot stood in the kitchen, stirring soup, listening to Corinne's steady breathing from the cradle in the next room, and she thought that this was freedom. Not loud, not brilliant, with no one rushing in to hold her, only a pot of soup on the stove and a sleeping baby, and a woman who finally didn't have to be afraid anymore. 2 weeks after Randall's call, on a morning when Margot was photographing Corinne on the soft blanket because the baby had just learned how to grasp her own finger, Randall texted, "There's a letter for you sent through my office. It's not from Barrett. It's from his mother." Margot thought of Catherine Langford, the woman she had met only 4 times in the 3 years she had been a daughter-in-law, 60 years old, silver-haired, quiet, polite to the point of coldness, and Margot had never been certain what Catherine truly thought of her, or of anything at all. The letter was written on plain white paper, the handwriting small, slightly trembling at the end of each line, 3 lines, no more. "I don't defend my son. I only want you to know that I know my granddaughter exists, and I'm ashamed of this family. If one day you allow it, I would like to meet her." No full signature, only a single C at the end. Margot folded the letter, went into the bedroom, pulled the old shoebox from beneath the bed, the box that held the first ultrasound photo she had gripped in her hand for 4 hours in her father's car from Boston back to Camden, placed Catherine's letter beside the photo, then pushed the box back. She didn't answer the letter. Not yet. Maybe one day, but not today. A week later, Randall called again, his voice careful. "Barrett sent you a video. 2 minutes. You don't have to watch it." Margot opened the video that evening after Corinne had fallen asleep. Barrett appeared on the screen, and she almost didn't recognize him. Not the Barrett in the gray suit on the red carpet with that confident smile, but a man sitting in an empty room, unshaven, hollow-eyed, wearing a wrinkled gray t-shirt, and he said, his voice hoarse, slow, heavy, "Margot, I know you won't answer my calls. I don't deserve for you to. I'm not sending this video to ask you to come back, or to forgive me. I'm sending it because I want to say what I should have said a long time ago. I'm sorry. For everything. Not because I want you to forgive me, but because our daughter will one day ask why her father wasn't there. And I want you to be able to say that at least he apologized." Margot watched it once, only once, and didn't watch it again. Then she took out paper and a pen and wrote right there on the bed, without a draft, because she had been thinking about this for a long time. "Barrett, I let you go a long time ago, not because you deserve forgiveness, but because holding on to anger was taking up space meant for better things in my life. Our daughter's name is Corinne. She's healthy. She has a grandfather who built her a cradle from white oak. She has everything she needs. If you want to know your daughter, become someone she doesn't have to be ashamed to mention, through lawyers, through time, no shortcuts." She folded the letter and sent it through Randall the next morning, without including a photo of Corinne. Not yet. Maybe one day, but not today. And she never saw Barrett Langford in person again. Never. Everything between them from that point on passed through paper, through lawyers, because Margot had understood that forgiveness didn't mean opening the door for the person who hurt you to walk back in. Forgiveness was setting the burden down for yourself, while the door was still yours to keep closed. And she chose to keep it that way. Spring came, and Margot began doing real work. She photographed Agnès's bakery, shooting cannoli and focaccia in the natural light from the window, designing the Instagram page. And within 2 months, the little bakery in South Boston went from being unknown to having thousands of followers online and lines outside the door every weekend. Agnès stood behind the counter, looking at the crowd with an expression that was both pleased and irritated, then said, "I hate the internet, but I like money." While Margot worked upstairs, Corinne stayed downstairs in the bakery with Agnès, and when Margot thanked her for helping watch the baby, Agnès looked at her with those sharp black eyes. "This isn't help. This is a grandmother's privilege. Don't get confused." And then there was Zane, who continued to show his care through actions rather than words. One evening, the kitchen window no longer stuck. The next week, the sink stopped leaking. The week after that, a small wooden bookshelf appeared on the wall in Corinne's room. Margot hadn't asked. Zane hadn't asked. He simply came, fixed something, then left. And every time he left the apartment, something worked better than before. And Margot understood that this was his language, the way a man who didn't know how to say "I care" with words said it through screws and wrenches and a shelf board planed smooth. Then came that night. At 2 o'clock in the morning, Corinne had a fever, her forehead burning hot, 102.6 degrees Fahrenheit, and Margot carried her down the stairs and called Zane. He was at the bakery, and 5 minutes later, his car was already at the door. The doctor examined Corinne and said it was an ear infection, common in infants, that she needed antibiotics, that it wasn't dangerous. Margot sat in the waiting room chair, holding Corinne, who had stopped crying because the fever medicine was beginning to work, and she fell apart. Not from fear, but from relief, from exhaustion, because for the past 3 months she had raised her daughter alone, had been strong alone, and now, at 2 o'clock in the morning in a hospital waiting room, she allowed herself not to be strong anymore, just for 1 minute. Zane sat beside her. He didn't hold her. He didn't say it would be all right. He only placed his hand on the back of the chair behind her, not touching her, only near, and Margot leaned into his hand, the first time she touched him, not because she was afraid, but because she wanted to, because she chose to, because his shoulder was there, and she was tired. On the drive home, Corinne slept in the back seat, and Margot said softly without looking at Zane, "I know who you are, Zane. I know your world. But tonight my daughter had a fever, and the only person there was you. Not her biological father. You." Zane drove with his eyes on the road. "What do you want me to say?" Margot turned to look at him, at the faint scar along his jaw glowing beneath the streetlights. "I don't want you to say anything. I want you to keep being there." Silence. Then the corner of his mouth lifted. Not a smile, only the closest thing to a smile she had ever seen on him. And he nodded once, slowly, and the silence between them at 3 o'clock in the morning on the streets of Boston, with the baby sleeping in the back seat, was the kind of silence no one needed to fill, because it was already full. The reporter found Margot on a November afternoon while she was pushing Corinne's stroller near the bakery. Not paparazzi, but a journalist who wrote a women's column for a major Boston newspaper, with a gentle voice and warm eyes, offering a well-paid interview. Margot looked at Corinne sleeping in the stroller with the yellow knit hat Phoebe had made for her, and she thought that she had been silent long enough. Silence had protected her, but now she was standing steady. And maybe it was time for that silence to be replaced by something useful to someone other than herself. She agreed to the interview, refused the money, and when she sat in front of the camera in the small apartment, with Corinne sleeping in the cradle in the next room, she said, "I don't want to tell this story so people will pity me. I want to tell it because there are thousands of women out there sitting alone, being left behind, thinking their lives are over. I want them to know, your life isn't over. It's beginning." On Christmas Eve, Agnès's bakery closed to customers but opened for family. Agnès made pasta with braised beef sauce and 2 trays of cannoli, and around the long table in the bakery kitchen sat Walter, Phoebe, Margot with Corinne on her lap, Agnès at the head of the table, Trask eating silently in the corner, and Zane beside his mother, his sleeves rolled up, flour on his arm because he had helped Agnès knead dough all afternoon. After dinner, while Walter washed dishes and Phoebe sat on the floor playing with Corinne, Zane disappeared onto the roof, and Margot followed him up, because she had grown used to the way he needed a piece of open sky to breathe. The bakery roof was small, just enough room for 2 people to stand, with a rusty iron railing, and below it was the South Boston street glittering with Christmas lights, soft snow falling. Zane stood leaning against the railing, smoking, and when Margot stepped out, he shifted aside to make room for her. They were silent for a while. Then Zane said, his eyes on the city, "My father died when I was 10, because of his work." He didn't explain further. Margot didn't ask. "My mother baked bread from 4 o'clock the next morning, then the morning after that, then for the next 30 years. She said if she stopped kneading dough, she would fall apart, so she never stopped." He breathed out white smoke that blended with the snow, then added, his voice so soft that Margot had to lean closer to hear it, "I'm like my mother. If I stop, I'll have to feel. And I haven't allowed myself to feel anything in a very long time." Margot looked at him, at the scar along his jaw glowing beneath the streetlight, at the flower on his sleeve because he had kneaded dough with Agnès that night, at his tired, dark brown eyes, lonely in the way only people who have been strong for too long can be lonely. She lifted her hand and touched the scar on his jaw, gently, and Zane tilted his face into her palm, closing his eyes, and Margot understood that this was the greatest gesture he had ever made in front of her, greater than driving through the snowstorm, greater than sitting outside the hospital room all night, because this was the moment he allowed her to see that he needed someone. She kissed him in the falling snow on the roof of the bakery on Christmas Eve, and he stood still for 1 second before both his hands lifted her face, and he kissed her back, slowly, as if he were afraid she might change her mind. When they pulled apart, forehead resting against forehead, he said, his voice hoarse, "I won't tell you I'm a good man, because I'm not. But my mother taught me there are sacred things that mustn't be touched with dirty hands. You and Corinne are that to me. I'll keep you both in the cleanest place I have. Can you accept a promise like that?" Margot looked at him and said, "I accept." They were married on an ordinary Tuesday morning in June at Boston City Hall, with only Walter, Agnès, Phoebe, and 6-month-old Corinne in a yellow dress, holding the paper flower Phoebe had folded by hand in the car on the drive down from Portland, and she held that flower through the whole ceremony, occasionally putting it into her mouth to chew because she was cutting her first teeth. Margot wore a white sweater and jeans because Phoebe had said, "Nobody wears white the second time. Just wear the color that makes you want to live." And Margot laughed. A white sweater doesn't count. Zane wore a black shirt and the tie he was wearing for the first time in his life, because Agnès said her son wasn't going to stand before a judge to take a wife while looking like he was going out for breakfast, and she tied it for him in the City Hall lobby, her hands quick, her eyes stern, then smoothed the lapels of her son's shirt and gave one single nod, which was the greatest compliment she had ever given anyone. Walter stood beside his daughter in the only white shirt he owned, the shirt he had worn at his own wedding 30 years earlier, a little tight across the shoulders, and when the judge asked who was giving away the bride, he held his daughter's hand, squeezed it once, then let go, and Margot saw that her father's eyes were wet but his mouth was smiling, and she knew he was thinking of her mother. Phoebe took pictures with her phone, most of them blurry because she was crying while she took them, but there was one clear photo that Margot would later frame and hang on the stairway, the photo of the moment Zane truly smiled after the judge pronounced them husband and wife, smiling with his whole face, his eyes narrowing, the scar disappearing into the crease of that smile. And it was the first time Margot had ever seen him smile like that. Nearly 5 years later, a summer Saturday morning, Margot woke to the sound of Corinne's bright laughter rising from downstairs, and she lay still for a while, eyes closed, listening, because it was the most beautiful sound she knew. Corinne, 5 years old, with black curly hair, was downstairs in the bakery with Agnès, the two of them standing at the dough table, the little girl slapping the dough so flour flew everywhere, and demanding to shape a dinosaur, while Agnès grumbled that there was no such thing as a dinosaur made of bread dough, and flour clung all over Corinne's face, all over the little apron Agnès had sewn from fabric, cut from one of her own old aprons. Walter sat at the table by the window drinking coffee. He came down to Boston once a month. The second son, Joseph Walter Castellano, a year old, plump and always smiling, sat playing with a wooden toy beside the white oak cradle near the counter. It hadn't been used for Corinne, because she had grown too fast, but was now being used for Joseph, the grandchild who carried his grandfather's name. Zane was in the small woodworking shop behind the bakery, the shop he had built the year before, after Walter taught him how to hold a plane, how to choose wood, how to read the grain. The two men built things together whenever Walter came down to visit: tables, chairs, shelves, wooden toys for Corinne. And that was how two men of few words spoke to each other, through the sound of wood being planed and the patient silence both of them understood. Margot was now a well-known food photographer in Boston, with a small studio on the third floor of the building. And every Monday she still photographed the menu for Agnes's bakery for free because Agnes said, "I don't pay my daughter-in-law, and my daughter-in-law doesn't refuse me." Phoebe arrived close to noon, the trunk of her car full of sunflowers because Corinne said sunflowers looked like the sun and she liked the sun, and she sat down beside Margot on the stairstep, connecting the bakery to the apartment, the step where Margot had once nearly fallen, the step where Zane had caught her elbow for the first time, the step that had now been repaired, firm and steady, no longer loose. Phoebe asked softly, "Do you remember the day you sat on the stone bench in front of the hospital? Nearly 5 years ago?" Margot looked at Corinne trying to shove a sunflower into her grandfather Walter's hair, while he stood completely still and endured it, and she said, "The worst day wasn't that day. It was the day before. The day I was still sitting there waiting for Barrett to call back. The day I still believed that waiting for someone who didn't deserve me was love. The day on the stone bench was only the day I was finally allowed to stop waiting and start living." Phoebe rested her head on Margot's shoulder, and the two of them sat in silence, listening to Corinne laugh, listening to the sound of wood being planed from the workshop out back. Zane stepped out of the woodworking shop, sawdust on his hands, placed beside Margot a cup of coffee, made exactly the way she liked it, the way she never had to ask for, then went into the bakery and lifted Joseph from Agnes's arms, settling him on his shoulder, and Joseph grinned wide because he loved seeing the world from up high. Margot held the coffee cup, warmth seeping into her palms, sitting beside her best friend on that very doorstep, and she thought there was something she wanted to say to someone out there, someone sitting alone and believing no one was coming. "Every morning I wake up and smell bread from downstairs, the smell of flour, butter, and rising yeast. No one looks at a loaf of bread and thinks about flour, water, and salt. People only see that it's beautiful. But I know every ingredient. I know every crack. And I know the thing that held it together wasn't one hand, but many hands. My father's hands, calloused from wood. Phoebe's hands, sticky with flour sap. Dr. Marsh's hands, warm and steady. Agnes' hands, white with flour. And Zane's hands, the hands that set a cup of coffee beside me every morning without me needing to open my mouth. I learned that accepting help isn't weakness, but the greatest strength a person can have. That forgiveness doesn't mean opening the door for the person who hurt you to walk back in, but setting the burden down so your hands are free to build again. That real love doesn't arrive through promises on a red carpet, but through a cup of coffee every morning, through a new lock put in place when you didn't ask, through a hot pot of soup left at your door with only one sentence: "The baby needs hot food." And that family isn't the people who carry the same last name, but the people who choose to show up. When someone reaches out a hand to you, take it. Not because you're weak, but because you're brave enough to believe you deserve it. If this story touched you, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories every day. Hit like and share this video with someone you love. Because who knows, this small story might be a light for someone sitting in the dark. How did this story make you feel? Which character touched you the most? Please share in the comments. We'd love to hear the feelings from your heart. Wishing everyone good health, a joyful life, and peace every day. Goodbye, and see you in the next video.